Good evening, everybody. I'm George Edwards. I've been flown at a huge expense to chair this packed meeting of No2id tonight. I'd just like to introduce you to the main speakers. On my left, I think that's technically known as stage left, is Guy Herbert, who's General Secretary of No2id, who, of course, you will all know, although you won't find out very much about him if you search the web, because you've got a very low web presence, Guy. I've just discovered that Guy and I share a town in Yorkshire in common. That's all I'll say about that. And just to let you know, Guy, that I have actually redeemed my badge earlier on today, so I could wear the badge with pride. On my right, Dr. Gabb, who some of you may know is a prolific writer and libertarian, and the rumour is that on one occasion the BBC turned off his microphone. That won't be happening tonight, Sean. I think the procedure basically will be opened by Guy, by Sean, so you see I got it right, who will speak to us, and then I will pass over to Guy, and at the end we'll have some time for questions, which I will endeavour to ask everybody to ask a question.
Thank you, Sean. I'd like to thank the organisers of No2id for having invited me here tonight. It is a great pleasure that I'm here. And I'd like to thank all of you for having turned out on a rather indifferent February evening to listen to us talking about identity cards. Now, I do appreciate that we are preaching to the converted. I don't think there is anyone here who is in any sense uncertain about whether identity cards are good or a bad thing.
I don't know anything much.
Very well, thank you. So we do not have necessarily all of the converted among us. So let me begin by giving some brief arguments against the idea of a compulsory state identification system. We are told that if you have nothing to fear, you have nothing to hide. And most of us are, for the most part, perfectly law-abiding people. We go about our daily business, and although we are watched in many respects, we take no notice of this, and the authorities take no notice of us. And so, for many people, the idea of having to carry an identity card and having to present this in order to receive various goods and services, and on occasion having to present it to the authorities to identify ourselves for the elimination of suspects in a crime investigation, does not sound very much. But it is quite a lot. It does fundamentally change the relationship between state and citizen. And what I could do is start talking about some ghastly science fiction dystopia like 1984, where you have the thought police sniffing around every day and night, every minute of the day and night, and where you're watched and watched and watched, and where if you cry out in your dreams, that may be taken as signs of thought crime, you'll be taken off and murdered in various unpleasant ways. But you see, that is very unlikely to happen in this country. It is very unlikely that the British state will open concentration camps and start packing us into them. The practical objection to identity cards, apart from all the usual legal ones about how the state is utterly incompetent to keep our data safe, the practical objection to identity cards is that the more we are watched, the more our behaviour is altered. Now, the fact that I knew that I was bringing my video camera with me here tonight meant that I did put on a suit. It also meant that before the meeting started, I brushed my hair. And that's a little thing, but I knew that I was being observed by more than the people here. And so it changed my behaviour. Now, if you know that you are being watched in all of your actions, you will do certain things that you would not otherwise have done, and you will not do certain things that you otherwise would have done. My friend Brian Micklethwaite was once asked, so what's your objection to surveillance cams at bus stops? And he said, because I might be filmed picking my nose. It sounds rather silly, but as I said, to be observed is to have your behaviour altered. Now, I can remember many years ago, when I was still young, I went on an inspection tour of the various naughty bookshops in Soho. And I paused at the door of some rather inviting-looking emporium, and it was as if I was glued to the spot. I couldn't step across that threshold into the dimly lighted interior. I felt an overpowering sense of shame. There was a feeling that passed off with time, but when I was 19, that was it. Now, no one was watching me, at least nobody I knew was watching me, but if I had thought that somebody I knew was watching me, I would have walked straight past that bookshop, shaking my head in disgust at the contents therein. There was a time when I felt rather ashamed of smoking. I was quite willing to smoke in front of strangers, but I didn't smoke in front of my mother, because it might have attracted a questioning look. And so I didn't smoke in front of my mother. Now, these are little things, but we all do things which are not necessarily illegal and are not necessarily grossly immoral, but they are things which might cause us a certain degree of embarrassment if we knew they were being logged against us. I don't know what is your particular interest. You may be a secret fan of rap music. You may like eating junk food. There are many things you may want to do. And if you know that your movements are being logged via surveillance cameras, or more particularly via an identity card system, you will be more cautious in your behaviour. And that is very much the case, bearing in mind other developments. We're being told that people who smoke will not be treated automatically under the National Health System. We're told that the very fat people will be penalised if they continue to eat fatty food. We're told that there's a whole range of lifestyle choices which may impact on our health, and that the National Health Service will, so far as possible, withdraw treatment from us. Now, at the moment, there is no way for the authorities to know whether you smoke or how much you smoke. Unless you die and are cut open, it's very difficult for the authorities to see what colour your lungs are. But if we have an identity card system, it will not be a piece of cardboard with your photograph stuck on it. It'll be a biometric smart chip identity card, which will have the capacity to log all of your purchases and all of your visits and all the things you borrow from the library. And when that happens, it will become possible to say, well, I'm sorry, but according to our records, you've smoked 20 packs of cigarettes a week for the past 25 years, and now you've had a heart attack. You're on your own. You've paid your taxes, but you've broken the contract with the NHS. Now that is something that an identity card system can bring about. There is then a rather more frightening possibility. And this is not necessarily an identity card effect, it is a surveillance effect. We have the biggest DNA database in the world, and sooner or later the majority of people will be added to this one way or the other. The government's working on this. Now, we are going through an interesting period of scientific progress, and it is possible to look at the genetic makeup of a child and say, this child will have a tendency to obesity, this child will have bad eyes, this child will have diabetes, this child will probably produce further children with Down syndrome, or in a few years' time, this child will have criminal or murderous or otherwise dangerous tendencies. Now, once it is possible for the scientists to do that, or rather, once it's possible for the scientists to believe they can do that fact, plus the DNA database, plus identity card systems, will make it possible for the authorities to start licensing childbirth, to say that only certain people should produce children. This is not murder, this is not the Holocaust, not killing anybody. We are simply stopping undesirable elements from being born. There is There is nothing unpleasant about this. We're simply stopping from coming about what otherwise would have come about. I can hear the arguments. Now, you may say, I have nothing to hide, therefore I have nothing to fear. But when you say that, you are gambling on the continued good sense and moderation of the authorities in this country. And this present government has managed what I regard as an astonishing achievement. It is even less liberal than the Conservatives were. 10 years ago, 11 years ago, when Michael Howard was in full flood, I had trouble imagining anything worse, but they managed. And who knows what the next government will be like, and the government after that. When you accept an identity card system, and when you accept surveillance in general, you are gambling on the continued good sense of moderation of the authorities. You are gambling for yourselves, and you are gambling for your children, because it may be that you will not be allowed to have grandchildren, or you will not be allowed to have great-grandchildren. It is as simple as that. Now, this does not require anything like Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, nothing like the Spanish Inquisition. It will all be done very gently. But it will be done if it can be done. And at the moment, we still have the option to say, no, we do not want this to be done. We may fail, they may railroad this through despite our objections, but we still have a chance at the moment to make our objections heard and to hope that our objections will be heard, maybe by this government, which is rather worried about cost and security, maybe by the Conservatives, who, let's be fair, have promised that they would scrap an identity card system, though I must admit I don't believe them. So it is important that we should make our objections known and felt as loudly and as often as possible. With that, I think I have spoken long enough. I could drone on for hours about this, but you know the arguments. I put them as well as I can, as shortly as I can, and I'm sure that you all have other things that you want to say. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Sean. That's the first time I've actually heard the Hawthorne effect used as a justification for not introducing the ID card, which is an experiment carried out in America in the 20th century. When they discovered that the very act of observation changed people's behaviour, whatever it was intended for. Very interesting. And I was also interested by your final point there, which is just because we can do it doesn't mean we must do it, which is a distinction that's very often not made. I think what I'd like to do, if we could, is to move straight on to our next speaker and then take up the discussion afterwards, because it does tend to be that the second speaker picks up some of the questions that come up from the floor of the first one. So, go ahead, it's your floor.
Well, I'm very glad to be here this evening. Didn't come to be here by any great planning. I came to be here because I said, yes, I would help with a small organisation to manage a pub. So I don't come with any vast background. I have no huge authority. But I think after 3 years of working on the campaign against identity cards, I can claim to quite a lot of knowledge about the scheme and about the way the scheme is being managed and about the ways that we could fight the national identity scheme. One thing that the government says very, very often is that this is all voluntary. It's going to be voluntary for British citizens. But when you look into it, it's a very, very odd definition of voluntary. The way the Identity Cards Act is structured, it is possible for the Secretary of State, which would be Jackie Smith in this case, but it might be any subsequent Home Secretary, to do what is called designate any document issued by under an Act of Parliament, by any government act in the Parliament, or by the Scottish Parliament, say, or the Welsh Assembly, or by a council. And by designating that document, could we say a fishing license, to take a very absurd and trivial example, the Secretary of State effectively requires you to apply to be registered on the National Identity System if you wish to have that document. Now, you may not be a very keen fisherman, but most of you will drive. Most of you will have passports. Many, many of you will be working either as a volunteer or as a professional in medical field or in education, and thereby require these days a criminal records bureau certificate. And those three documents, passport, driving license, criminal records bureau certificate, have been explicitly described by the government in its plans so far as the ideal designated documents. So, in due course, the plan is it will be voluntary to apply to become registered on the National Identity Register, along with your passport. You don't have to have a passport. It will be voluntary to, if you wish to take up a driving license and to learn to drive at some stage in the future, to register on the National Identity Register. It will be voluntary because you don't have to drive. You can choose not to. It will be voluntary not to have a criminal records bureau certificate. There's a number of employments in which you can get a job without a criminal records bureau certificate, and this is extending to the whole of academia now, as well as all medical practice, even down to the cleaners in doctors' clinics. You can choose not to have any of those jobs. And perhaps if you're a doctor, throw away 20 or 25 years of education. If you choose not to register for an identity card. So it's a very, very strange sort of choice that is being offered to us. And the other thing about this volunteering is it's one time only. Once you are registered on the National Identity Register, then there's no going back. You can't be deregistered. There are actually no provisions at all in the Identity Cards Act for people to be taken off the National Identity Register. The details that are kept on the register can be altered by the Secretary of State if he believes them to be wrong. But once you're on there for life. And in fact, for quite a long time after you're dead, potentially. And being on there then introduces all sorts of duties. You have to report where you live. You have to report when you move. You have to report when any of the 50 categories of registrable facts that are going to be kept on the register. And those registrable facts could be extended by order by the Secretary of State. When any of those facts change, you have to report to the authorities. That's the framework of the Act. So it's a very odd sort of voluntary system that we're being gently persuaded to take part in. And you will have heard that it's being put off. Well, not very much it isn't. What's happening is that they can't quite get some bits of it to work, so they're doing it another way. So the emphasis has changed. Passports have moved back into the background a little bit. And what's been brought forward a little bit is the possibility of asking for people to register when they take a driving license. Initially, they're talking about doing people in particular reserved occupations would have to have identity cards. From 2009, that's how they get the magic 2009 date, which ministers have been promising us. British people will have identity cards from 2009. Originally that was to be through passports. It's now not going to be through passports. It's going to be focused very tightly on some occupations and made a condition of having some occupations. occupations. Perhaps we think airport workers will be among the first. And then it moves on to young people. And young people getting their first bank accounts, young people getting their first driving licenses, young people getting grants or student loans to go into education. So the system hasn't been pushed back. The new plans that are being leaked aren't about the government dithering about whether or not to have the scheme. They're about rapid changes in the architecture of the scheme in order to take account of changed circumstances. So we still have to fight it. There is good news on fighting it. The good news is this: the more people know about the scheme, the more people become acquainted with the things that we've just spent the last 10, 20 minutes telling you about it, the unhappier they become. It ceases to be what was very popular at first, the idea of a plastic card, and people become much more aware of the database behind it, the database that is being kept, of the surveillance that Sean was talking about, that is inherent in the scheme. And that makes people very unhappy. And so we've moved from a position at the beginning of 2005 where a large majority of the population was in favour of the scheme, to a position just announced a couple of days ago, ICM poll asking precisely the same question that we asked in February 2005, says that more than 50% of the population are against. Fractionally more than 50% of the population are against. A minority of the population is in favour of ID cards. And 25% of the population is now convinced that it's a very bad idea. So that's hope. More people, the more familiar they become with the scheme, the more contempt they have for it. So that's the purpose, really, of No2id, fulfilled and shown to be valid and worthwhile. People won't turn against the scheme without us telling them about it. That doesn't just mean me telling you about it, but about you out there telling friends and neighbours about it too. Because the government is not talking about the scheme. It is talking in the blandest possible terms. It advocates, it is using the one point that it found has popular appeal, the idea that it will help in some way to control illegal immigration. And appeal very, very strongly to a sense of fear of foreigners and fear of the other in all sorts of ways. But it won't actually discuss the details of the scheme in it, and it certainly won't debate. I have been to numerous public debates to which the Home Office and government were invited. I think I have only been to one debate, a fringe meeting that we held at the Labour Party conference, at which a minister actually was prepared to turn up and argue with us. All praise to that minister, Andy Berg, he's now in the cabinet. And he did seem at the time to be one of the few ministers who actually had understood a little bit more than the brief. Many of them are just skating on the surface, just reading out words that are put in front of them. I'm slightly convinced that a lot of them don't know what they're doing or why they're doing it with this particular exercise. But there has been a consistent strategy from the Home Office, from the Identity and Passport Service as it is now is, and from government ministers and government politicians, just to avoid tackling the details. To the extent that if you go on a radio programme with a government minister, as happened to me a couple of weeks ago, it will be negotiated. The minister, you don't speak direct with the minister. And you say your piece, you interact with the announcer, and then afterwards the minister says, her piece it was in this case, interacts with the announcer, and you don't have an opportunity to come back and challenge anything that was said. So they always have the last word, and no debate is to be had. So we have to find a way around that block. And fortunately, there is a very good way around that block. It's called talking to other people. If the government won't talk about it, well, they give us quite an opportunity to talk about it ourselves. And we have a lot of scope to do that. Everybody in this room has friends and neighbours they can talk to. Everybody in this room is a little bit more aware than the average person about the nature of the scheme. And that education can spread. There's lots of stuff that you can get from our website. No2id is providing briefing to opposition parties, to non-governmental organisations. We exist very much as an educational organisation as well as a campaigning organisation, because we don't need to lie. All we have to do is elucidate the details that are in public and semi-public documents. And people generally take one step back. That's not, is that really what it's about? I'm afraid it is. It's a very, very mendacious presented scheme. Ministers always talk about identity cards. They very, very seldom talk about the National Identity Register. They talk about convenience for the citizen, but what's actually at stake is convenience for the state, and your privacy is disposable under those circumstances. There's a competition between individual security and national security, whatever that means, and individual security loses out. So we have to fight. We can fight by education. We can fight by example. One of the things that I came here to talk about this evening was something that we launched at the end of last year, and we are continuing to move forward with, and is a mechanism, more than that, for spreading the resistance and for reinforcing people's fight against the scheme. We're calling it the No2id Pledge. It is deliberately modelled on the pledge that many people took in the 19th and 20th century to abstain from alcohol. It's modelled like that, not particularly because we're abstainers from alcohol, I can tell you that I'm not, but because there is a very well-established mechanism there. It has been tried and tested. It was tried and tested for 40, 50, 60 years in the 19th and 20th century. Individuals take a pledge to abstain from alcohol, or, in this case, simply to abstain from participation in the scheme. What we've done is we have formulated a promise that anybody can take, that anybody can administer. This is a very pretty No2id branded certificate, but any group could produce its own certificates. As long as they're taking the same pledge, making the same chain letter, if you like, then it works. And we have simplified as far as possible what you have to do to avoid the government implementing the scheme. If enough people resist, it cannot be implemented. As simple as that. You promise publicly, witnessed by somebody you know. It's very much more difficult to welch on a promise if you said it to somebody else. I shall not register for a national identity card. I shall not supply personal details or fingerprints to a national identity register. I shall not apply for any document or service if joining the National Identity Register is a condition of obtaining it. I shall not cooperate with any identity and passport service interview concerning my identity. And the most important of all, I also promise that by my advice and example, I shall encourage others to do the same. All of those promises are entirely legal. And because of the way the government has committed itself to introducing the scheme voluntarily, they are likely to remain entirely legal for a very, very long time. What's more, at the moment, there is no cost to any individual in taking those promises and sticking by them. And the more people who stick by them now, the less incentive there is for the government to go through with its scheme, because the more likely it is it will encounter a vast and immovable obstacle, a wedge in its door of determined people. You know what happens if you try to slam a door with a wedge in it? The door comes off. So we are trying to encourage people to sign this pledge and make this pledge to others and encourage other people to take it now, before it's difficult. Now it is easy to resist. And it's going to stay easy to resist, and it will get easier to resist the more people who do resist. And what's more, by making the pledge, by telling people about the pledge, you also tell them about the mechanics of the scheme. This absurd voluntary system, where you can't actually have a life without volunteering in the government's ideal model. So, we want people to stop it now, essentially. The government could stop the scheme now. All it needs is enough incentive. And the incentive for any politician is the knowledge that he's going to be very, very unpopular. And by spreading the word about what's wrong with this scheme and what you can do to stop it, you guarantee that in the future the scheme will be very unpopular. It's as simple as that. It's designed to be simple. It's designed to be easy to spread. If everybody in this room, I said this last week, so it's actually easier than it was last week. If everybody in this room were to take a pledge tonight and to persuade one person to take that pledge in every subsequent month, and each person they introduced one person a month to the pledge. By the end of 2 years, by the beginning of this miraculous 2010, when they start in the Pleasanton plan to introduce identity cards for student loans, by that point we would have more than 1 million people signed up to the pledge, more than 1 million resistants, more than 1 million people implicitly who know what the scheme is all about. If you ask people, are they in favour of identity cards? Now we know most people aren't. But still we know the vast majority of people don't know the content of the scheme. They're just feeling a little bit uneasy because of the disastrous releases of data in previous days. And they're just feeling a little uncertain that the government is to be trusted. But the more we fight back, the more people will have that impression. So it's a virtuous circle, a potential avalanche, but certainly a snowball. And I really come here this evening to ask you to keep that snowball rolling. Do join No2id. Do take the pledge. But most important of all, encourage other people to take an interest. It is ignorance and darkness, the fact that the scheme is being promoted without public knowledge, without public interest, that makes it possible to do it at all. If people knew the content of the government's identity cards and data sharing initiatives, there would be no way it could be done. So, I've told you a little bit about it. Please ask me more about it. But if you go away from this evening with anything from my speech, anything from Sean's speech. The thing that we should do is tell other people, get other people to take an interest, and we will win this fight.
Thank you very much, Guy, for helping to squash what's called the idea of a plastic card. A few weeks ago I was talking to a colleague about the ID card scheme and beginning to explain this to him, and he said our government would never do that. And I said, yeah, well, the plans are afoot. He said there'll be rebellion in the countryside. I said, no, they're going to push it through. And he said, we'd never put up with it. The difference was that I was in Beijing and he was a member of the Communist Party. Even in China they couldn't do it. The rebellion. So thank you very much for that. Could I take any questions, please? A forest of waving palms, I think, is the traditional. Yes, please, madam.
How less likely do you think the ID card scheme will be rolled out in view of the discs that have gone missing? Or do you think that will just, people got short memories?
It has had a massive effect, certainly on interest in No2id. It was noticeable that nearly every media commentator, nearly every media interviewer in the aftermath of first BAT and the MOD data losses said to ministers who popped up, doesn't this kill the identity card scheme? And ministers didn't really have an answer. And they floundered around. Eventually they came up with, well, identity cards with biometrics, so that'll be all right. Biometrics is a magic word for ministers. What has happened is that various inquiries and reviews have been launched. And an inquiry and a review is a shorthand way of saying, well, we'll leave it for a bit and hope people will forget about it. But there's no sign at the moment that people are forgetting about it. But there is a danger, which is we need to tell them about it.
I think one has to be naive to assume that that's the first time the data's been lost. It's just the first time it became public.
Yes, we'll all know where it's on an ID database. Yes, yes, please.
So the IPS are already interviewing new passport applicants throughout most of the country now. Is that right?
They are.
But there's no national identity register to register people on at the moment.
No.
So can you explain why the pledge, the last item on the pledge, takes the form of word that it does? The one that says you will not.
Yeah. The reason is because we wish to interrupt and interdict that process. The only reason that there are interviews for passports is as a rehearsal for the identity card scheme. The entirety of the sale of the scheme to parliamentarians was based around the idea that 70% of this cost will be incurred anyway. We have to do it for passports, therefore we might as well do.
Which is a kind of lie, but yes.
It was utter lie. As far as we can tell, the 70% figure comes from the statistic that 70% of the population renews their passport over the course of 10 years, and this was originally to have been a 10-year scheme of introduction.
So can I follow up on that? If someone takes the pledge and then decides to apply for their first passport and gets called in for an interview, how should they respond to that?
I think they should say no. It is up to us to accept a little bit of inconvenience, to inconvenience the government a great deal.
Thank you. Yes.
I had a colleague who wrote about this 5 years ago, who was in TV news living in Spain, and he said if you ask people in the street why they need an ID card, they say, well, to do all the things that we couldn't do if we didn't have an ID card. I'm just wondering if once the ID card is brought in, and we'll just get used to it, is the battle over? Is it lost then? Is there any chance? I mean, given that we had them during the World War II and then they got rid of them afterwards.
Is that why we want privilege? Content
well,
rather than the process?
I suppose there's the concept of function creep. It will get to the point, you have various health and safety laws, various kinds of occupied liability laws, and best practice. And so it will gradually become embedded in civil society. It may get to the point where before you can attend a meeting like this, you will need to produce your identity card. And the reason is because at a previous meeting, some undesirable came in and caused some damage, and the organising body was sued, and insurers will now insist that before such a meeting can go ahead, you must have people produce their identity cards. You may be required to produce an identity card before you can join a library, not a local authority library, a private library. It may be that you'll be required to show your identity card before you can go to a place of worship. Indeed, I can well imagine that you will be required to show your identity card if you want to attend certain mosques. And so you'll have this function creep. And then the identity card system will crowd out the normal common sense restraints. I mean, if someone comes into this room at the moment who's rather smelly and obnoxious, you throw them out. Once you have an identity card system, there will be other procedures, and it will become unthinkable that you could do it any other way. If you join a library at the moment, if you don't return the books, or if they're late, or if you deface the book, the libraries have ways of dealing with you. But once an identity card scheme has come in and fines can be automatically deducted via the identity card scheme, it becomes unthinkable how we would ever function without this. So that's the real problem. Once they, we don't need them, we've never really had them, and we can live life without them. But once we've had them for 5, 10, certainly 20 years, it will become increasingly difficult to imagine life without an identity card.
Thank you, Sean. I think I'd like to follow up on function.
Yeah, I mean, that's the black side of the argument. And it is true that administrative procedures get very, very rapidly embedded in life. And whenever I'm talking to people from countries which have had identity cards for a long time, they can't necessarily see any problem with them, although very many of the identity card systems in the world are significantly less intrusive than ours. I think people do tend to accept it. The good side, however, is that it has happened before. We have got rid of them before. And they've even got rid of residence permits in Russia, although restrictions are starting to come back into Russia. But once upon a time, one could not wander around in Russia without one's propiska, one's residence permit on one. But in 1994, the Russian Constitutional Court decided that this was unconstitutional. So even in a country that has been under authoritarian rule for decades, or centuries in Russia's case, these things can change. In Britain, it could change very rapidly indeed. We didn't have identity cards during the Second World War. We had identity cards for 4 years during the Second World War, and for 7 years afterwards. They were kept on because they were officially convenient, and they were stopped when the public really got fed up with them. And there's a very, very celebrated case of a dry cleaner who was stopped in the Finchley Road by a policeman, asked to produce his identity card. And Mr. Clarence Wilcock in December 1950 said, "No, I am a Liberal. I am against that sort of thing." And Mr. Clarence Wilcock was eventually funded by the Liberal Party and taken all the way to the High Court of England. And a special appeal court bench, a full bank of 7 judges sat on his case. And they said, "Well, this is the law. We cannot discharge you that we're not going to award any costs against you, and you regard this as an unreasonable imposition by the state on the religion. And the next year, they were abolished by the incoming government. There will be a point at which we will not tolerate them anymore, and our aim as a campaign is to hasten that point.
Okay, yes.
The worrying thing is about this function creed, because they're going to, the latest thing is they're going to bring them in so that new students applying for a loan or anything like that will have to get them, and people applying for a driver's license. So you would get to a place where people start to get used to them as teenagers. It's exactly that. After 10 years, they will be so used to them, and they may not see what all the fuss is about if they never remember anything any other way. And that's very, very...
I think that's part of the government strategy on a number of things, which is the well-known Jesuit strategy, which is staying with the child. Yes, please.
Parent of two teenagers, I am disturbed, however many conversations we have with them, the level where you started of, but I do nothing wrong, so why should I worry? It seems to be very, very embedded. There's an awful lot of politically correct stuff that goes into their citizenship lessons, and even kids who normally argue about things and do think about things seem to be completely happy with the whole thing, just shrug their shoulders and why should it be a problem? I don't know how much of your campaign has been aimed at those young people who may well be where things are introduced first to alert them more.
I'd like to pick up on that one.
Well, it is quite difficult to engage with young people who are even less interested in politics, for the most part, than the rest of the population. But now that it is directly a problem for them, then there has been a considerable amount of interest, certainly from students' unions.
So the next level up.
Absolutely, from the next
GCSE.
Well, indeed, yeah. And it may be that a number of the other data sharing initiatives which have a direct impact on children may cause concern among children eventually. But at the moment, the profile of those initiatives is very low. Actually still quite popular among the public. The idea that every child in the country is now put on a database and all information about them is pooled is to me profoundly disturbing, but remains a popular idea among the public. It's until things start to go badly wrong with that, or until the folklore develops of things going badly wrong, rather than things going badly wrong themselves, because they can always be explained away, that popular resistance to that may be very small. And it is a difficult problem, you're quite right. The government essentially has children 6-7 hours a day for half the year
I'm not going to say indoctrinate.
I was going to get close to saying that, but it has what is taught to them in their power. Whereas a campaigning organisation, unless it's a very, very rich one, and can afford to give all chance to every school or something, finds it's quite difficult to reach people on that sort of scale.
Children do spend a large portion of the time not at school on the internet though. Do you have any sort of campaigns on Facebook and
We have both Facebook and MySpace groups, which are quite large, but not nearly as large as they might be.
It is very worrying that it's already in a lot of public consciousness, that business of, oh, well, I've nothing to hide, so therefore why should I object? How do you combat that when people say that?
Probably
We all have something to hide. Most of us are not criminals, as I said earlier. Most of us are not doing anything that other people would regard as grossly immoral. But we do have certain things to hide, certain things we do which we would be embarrassed to have other people know. Most people are just not aware of the extent to which their innermost lives would be open to inspection by the authorities. And the current scandals of the data loss, perhaps the government is right. Perhaps if you go quiet on this for a few months, people will forget, will move on, and we'll be more concerned about the Big Brother house in a few months. But I do hope Guy's right. I hope that some kind of folklore of resentment does linger after these scandals. And people do understand that once their innermost lives are recorded on these databases, they are open to inspection by a potentially indefinite number of people. Something I often do if I go on the radio to talk about DNA databases is to say, okay, you trust the British state to use your data wisely. But under the Treaty of Prüm, which is about to become incorporated into European Union law, the British DNA database will be open to inspection by the Bulgarian security services and by any other member state of the European Union, which may in the next 10 years include Turkey.
I saw a few mouths dropping open.
And indeed, if you take a transatlantic flight,
Yes.
or any flight out of Heathrow actually, because China is among this too, all the information that is collected on you by the airline company, including all your credit card details, your home address, your car number plate, if you parked in the airport car park, which seat you sit in, which seat you actually booked for, your choice of meal, and anything else that they happen to have is forward transmitted to the American authorities or the Chinese authorities or wherever you happen to be going. There's a website, something I've looked at today. Formerly we had a free travel area between Ireland and Great Britain for many years because the untangling of Ireland from Great Britain was sort of incomplete and messy. The only way that it could work was to allow Irish people to settle and move freely into the British Isles, and British people to move and settle freely in Ireland. And according to treaty, there could be no levied hindrance to your movement. That has been of late adapted. You still can move freely, but there has been pressure put on the ferry companies or the air carriers to collect all passport data and travel data and transmit them to the authorities on both sides, so that a full record is kept of travel, even within the United Kingdom. If you travel from Northern Ireland to the British mainland. So if you go to a website called The Green Ribbon, which is a London Irish blog, the proprietor of that blog has had a Freedom of Information Act request to the Irish and British authorities to discover exactly what information they're collecting. And there's a nice long list of all the information that will be collected on you if you travel between Britain and Ireland or Britain and Ireland.
Yes. What else with questions? Yes, please.
There was this recent leaked internal report which talked about coercing individuals through the designated documents.
Yes.
That doesn't seem to have had as much publicity as it ought to have done, or has it?
It was unfortunate that several things happened at similar times.
Yeah.
We had a lot of publicity in the previous week concerning a related leak. But the coercion problem came out at roughly the time that Mr. Derek Conway's exploitation of his parliamentary expenses rather took over the airwaves. So we had. But I'm afraid that's how publicity works. Whatever captures the public interest is what gets picked up. But that leak will have had a very considerable impact. We are very confident. Because when the government comes to make the announcements that would have introduced that, everybody else is forewarned and forearmed. So we rather hope that there will be consternation in the Identity Passport Service and the office.
The mainstream media often seems to be quite a long way behind the internet on these things. I expect that will make the front page of the Telegraph in 6 weeks. Yes. Yes.
In 2003 and 2004, I was involved in fighting the proposed children's database amongst the higher education community because we were very concerned about it. And one of the difficulties with that seemed to be that because the technology now exists for the first time, there's a huge momentum towards the government adopting it and trying it out to see what it can do. And it seems difficult to fight that process until it becomes apparent what the problems are, and those problems can be clearly identified and expressed to the government, and alternative approaches can be presented. If you were to have an ID card scheme with national databases for the purposes that you think government are working towards for their convenience, what alternatives would you suggest?
Good question.
What you're asking is if we don't have an identity card scheme, what else should we have? And my answer is we should have nothing. We have managed so far without identity cards, and we do carry a lot of identification with us at most times. If you fall under a bus, the police usually can find your next of kin within a few hours. That is voluntary identification. We carry it when we want. We carry the identification that we want, and that has always so far proved sufficient. And so I see no reason why we shouldn't carry on forever and ever without state-issued identity cards.
That's, no, you have something?
Quite so. However, if you wanted to create a national identity scheme, the form of national identity scheme that the Home Office has come up with is not just a bad one. It is just about the worst conceivable. In that, just like the contact point database, which I'm afraid is starting to be up and running now, and now we have a common assessment framework following on top of that. It is based around the idea of data sharing. That the way to identify people is to accumulate lots of information about them and spread it all over the place. To pass it between government departments. I'm afraid that what happens a lot of the time is that it is not that governments find new technology and want to play with it, so much as governments take new technology and try and do old-fashioned things based on a complete failure to understand modern technology. It need not be a national scheme. It could be strong identification, strong authentication of identity, could be run on a private basis or a semi-private basis. There are all sorts of ways you can go into it. But there need not be a central database. In fact, it is extremely desirable that there not be a central database. There is a technology consultant called Dave Birch, who writes a lot in the technical press, and is also well-known advisor on public technology. he has written a couple of times articles in Prospect magazine about his preferred version of the National Identity Scheme, which would have a central register, but the central register would be entirely encrypted, so that you could verify the individual to the register, but nobody could actually read the register itself and get information out of the register itself without the individual being involved. Now that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is simply to carry a digitally signed card, which can, using biometrics, the government thinks are magic, but are pretty certain, using biometrics, verify that you and the card belong together. Just as in olden days, a photograph was good enough to do that. And the information on the card is therefore applicable to you, as warranted by whoever issues the card. And by using modern technology, the technology that has been with us for rather longer than 10 years, but has only really become publicly known in the last 10, 15 years, you can prove pretty certainly that the person who issued that card was indeed the person who issued the card, and it's not a clever forgery. It's not readily open to forgery, because technology allows us to fix those facts and to make the document very, very hard to forge. So there are plenty of ways of using modern technology constructively to have forms of identification and forms of authentication, I don't think we should confuse the two, that serve the needs of the individual. The problem is that the government doesn't want that. The government wants a national identity scheme to serve the needs of the government, and to serve a government conception of how identity works, rather than a human conception of how identity works. The government conception of how identity works is that the person is the same as the file on that person. All that information in that pigeonhole represents what that person is. The more traditional version of what a person is, or what your identity is the sum of your relationships. And you may not be precisely the same person in all those relationships. Perhaps you're not the same person to your mother as you are in London. I don't know. I certainly aren't. So they are actually completely distinct models of what it means to be a person. And the National Identity Management Scheme, as it is often called, is about the government managing your identity. It's not about you having although the theoretical justification provides a convenient means for you to maintain and control your identity, it is conceptually quite the reverse. So it's not the technology that's at fault, it's the will of the government to use it in ways that in quite purblind blinker fashion, without really understanding what it's doing, serve its interests and serve its conceptions of what is good for you.
I think it's a very good point you make about the encryption versus the data. I mean, I have a sort of recurring nightmare of one day returning a late library book and the assistant looking at the screen there and saying, "Oh, are you still on the Prozac, Mr. Edwards?" You know, and I think that's the danger of this mission creep and the fact that all this data is there, you know. More questions, please? Yes.
The law didn't change. I don't understand it. There hasn't been a new law passed that went through the past roads. Always in this country, and still to my knowledge, a doctor can't discuss your medical history with anybody unless you explicitly gave written permission. And everything went like that. Now it seems to be the reverse. You have to give your permission if you don't want something done.
There's a point there about withholding data from the national base. Do you know about this?
I did write to my GP a few weeks ago. I sent a formal letter.
Oh, I did that,
Yes,
yeah.
yes,
I got
and I wrote a
50
letter
weeks
saying
to-
that my local surgery had no plans to cooperate with this scheme. But a medical practitioner is not privileged against giving information to the state for the purpose of criminal investigation. A priest cannot be. A priest cannot say that. A priest can't get away from giving evidence to the police. These are customary. These are customary privileges, which for the most part have been honoured by the authorities, but don't have to be.
And of course, the business about the prosecution becomes more critical when you know that the Secretary of State has the power to increase the use of the card, and possibly one day you will find that, you know, the fact that you bought some Araldite in the supermarket and you had to use your identity card means that your confidentiality will disappear entirely. They can make the purchase of Araldite a criminal offence. And
one might be more impressed with the security if it wasn't made very plain that if you're a celebrity, you and your child will not appear on the same database as more common vulnerable.
I'll be okay then.
But there is a protection in common law confidentiality. There is some protection in common law confidentiality. There is some protection in your rights to a private and family life under the Human Rights Act, under Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. There is some protection, very little, in the Data Protection Act. The Data Protection Act doesn't really do very much. And there is a great deal of protection in a legal principle called ultraviarious, which says essentially that powers are given for a purpose, and in law they may not be used for purposes other than they were given. But unfortunately, our dear government is at this very moment making plans to weaken all those barriers, as they call them, to information sharing. This was set out in something called the Information Sharing Vision Statement, issued by the Department of Constitutional Affairs, as it then was, under Lord Falconer, in November 2006. It has not gone away. It reappeared in something called the Transformational Service Agreement. Lovely, lovely language it is, which was issued at the same time as the Chancellor, the present Chancellor's pre-budget statement. So thank you very much for being notice of it at the time. And in the Transformational Service Agreement, which is well worth looking up on the Treasury website, if you have any tolerance at all for management jargon, is set out all the steps that all the departments are supposed to be taking in order to participate in transformational government or identity management. And among those, the Ministry of Justice, as it now is charged with carrying on removing the barriers, identifying and removing the barriers to information sharing. Pretty much every piece of significant legislation these days introduces some form of information sharing. And a classic example is the Children Act of 2004, which in, I think it's section 21, I will not swear to it, maybe section 12, I'm not looking the numbers up, provides that information should be provided to the Children Act database regardless of any rule of common or statute law that might present to prevent it being shared. And pretty much the same phraseology has applied in a number of pieces of significant legislation recently. The UK Borders Act, which deals with sharing of immigration data, and indeed the latest counter-terrorism bill, which provides for information provided to the intelligence services to be provided, regardless of any rule that would prevent it being otherwise. So that means more confidentiality of privacy and human rights or data protection.
Right, we'll be arrested for sitting.
Absolutely. I'm aware of the fact that we're the only people sitting here with cups in front of us, and our cups are empty. I suggest a couple more questions, and then possibly a break, and over a coffee or a tea bag, we could have an informal discussion together.
That sounds very good to me. I would like to point out that we have with us.
I was going to say closing remarks would be called for.
Copies of the No2id pledge that you can take away and play with as you wish. And we have various other No2id literature with us, so if anybody has any questions afterwards, we're very happy to answer.
So if I take one more question, maybe? Yes?
You suggested that the ministers might not be the driving force behind changes, that these might be brought to them, and they might not always be the source of the ideas or the momentum. Will you have any conjecture as to what is the driving force behind changes, what the government's intention is, or where it derives from?
There is almost a true faith of data sharing and informational governance. It is noticeable that even within the Home Office, although the Home Office has had as a departmental policy to introduce identity cards and a national identity register since before the First World War, and has used has been plotting the designated documents strategy since it was invented by one Sylvanus Percival in 1934. The Home Office itself did not create the National Identity Scheme. It was essentially created by hired external consultants.
Yes.
And so there is a sort of management cult living within the civil service, which and the civil service is to some extent hijacked by that cult of management by machines, although it has by no means been immune to the idea of managing everybody's lives for a happier, better world, which sort of goes with the territory of running a bureaucracy. The strange thing about this generation of ministers coming up against this generation of consultants with the internet and web computer at their beck and call is that this generation of ministers, or perhaps the one immediately before it, was certainly the last generation of people who had never themselves switched on their computer. I remember that it was about 9 years into his premiership that it was gleefully announced that Tony Blair had an email address and he used it. They don't know what they're doing, is my suggestion. But they sincerely believe that it is good. And the people promoting management of the country by a computer also sincerely believe that it is good. It's not a malign conspiracy. But it is nonetheless malign. It's just not malign in intent.
You're far more charitable to our government than I would be, Guy. I'd like to ask Sean for some closing remarks from the Libertarian point of view, and I'll ask Guy to close, and then we'll all break for refreshments.
Okay. I won't take long. We are rather lucky at the moment, in a rather bleak sort of way. For over a century now, civil libertarians in this country have been saying, if we carry on in this direction, we shall find ourselves in a police state. And these people were met by a wall of incredulity. How on earth can you become a police state? and England wasn't a police state, so what's the fuss about? Well, we are now in a police state, and I suppose the good thing about it, if you could find any good in this, is that we have a set of rulers who are not very bright. Most of us have regarded 1984 as, Orwell's novel 1984, as a dreadful warning of what could happen when you have unlimited state power plus high technology. The present generation of rulers have regarded 1984 as an instruction manual. And they are going about it so openly. Now, if I use phrases like Lord Chancellor's Department, Home Office, don't you think that those are rather familiar, reassuring sounds? If I then say Ministry of Justice, do you not feel a slight agency? What these people are doing is they are changing the spirit of our constitution, but they're also changing the forms, and it is very unwise to do both, because people will eventually wake up and notice what's being done to them. And I don't share Guy's great optimism about this, but I think his optimism is arguable. More and more people are at last waking up to the fact that we do not live in the kind of country into which we were born. And if we don't do something, we'll die in a very different country. So thank you very much.
And of course the records will be kept for 70 years after that happens. Guy?
Well, I've seldom been accused of being an optimist. I suspect that why I'm on this side of the argument, opposed to identity cards, opposed to the database state and all that goes with it, is because I'm actually rather a pessimistic person. I believe that if things can go wrong, they will. I believe that actually it is rather better for us to make our own mistakes bit by bit than to have them all made for us by somebody else. The people on the other side of the argument, the managerialists, the grand bureaucrats, the fine improvers of society, believe that if only they have enough information about us, they can make all our lives better for us, whether we like it or not. And that is the optimistic vision which drives them. So I'm actually a pessimist. But I am optimistic that we can win the argument. I'm optimistic that we are winning the argument. And I'm quite optimistic that we can actually win the practical battle as well. But what it does require is what I harped on about earlier in the evening, which is that everybody here goes home and takes the message with them and wakes everybody else up. A very, very famous phrase from the present Information Commissioner. He said, "We are sleepwalking into a surveillance state." I think he has now recanted from that and said that we are already in a surveillance state. But it is true that whether we are in a surveillance state or whether we've not yet reached a surveillance state, most of the population is still sleepwalking. And it's about time they were woken up.
Thank you very much, Guy. I'd like to thank our two speakers tonight, Dr. Sean Gabb, Guy Herbert, for giving their time.